first off, big thanks to the Truro Public Library and big nod to Galen and Trish for making this all happen. So I thought I'd just take 2 minutes to tell you how this book came to be. Yeah, so as my mother mentioned, I've spent most of my career when I'm not in a classroom in different countries and communities affected by armed conflict and genocide. And over the years, I noticed several themes kept reemerging. One was this just extraordinary courage and resilience of everyday folks that I would meet, and you'll meet a couple of those characters this evening. That it wasn't all horrible and bleak. I mean, war is horrible and bleak, but it also, you know, it is. I think Anne Michaels, a Canadian poet, said war is both the rotten part of the fruit and the fruit. And it shows that there's nothing man won't do to one another, but nothing man won't do for one another. And this is what I found everywhere I've worked: extraordinary courage. I've also seen the limits of resilience, right? When the terror was too great and pain too overwhelming. And everywhere I've worked, I've seen what happens when the limits of resilience are surpassed, and the ways in which culture shapes the expression of pain, but also the ways that people heal. And these aren't kind of cute cultural differences, they're profound differences that have to do with beliefs and spirit loss and reincarnation and all the things that one has to do to somehow make it through. And the last thing that I've seen everywhere I've worked is that a lot of researchers and clinicians were focused very narrowly in documenting the impact of the violence and loss of war. But as I spent time living in refugee camps and in a clinic in Chicago and in Kabul and in eastern Sri Lanka, what I kept hearing was people saying, it's not just about what we lived through in the war. Look at our lives now. Look at our homes. Look at this refugee camp. Look at the violence in our home. Women would say that, or kids. They look at the poverty, or the men would say, we can't work. Do you know how shameful it feels to not be able to work? So sure we drink, because it hurts. And it drew my attention over and over and over again to the here and now. That war isn't just about violence and loss. It's about the absolute chaos and chronically high stress of everyday life, when all the normal things of our daily lives have been upended. And it's about how people make it through under chronic adversity. So I noticed these themes, and I went to the literature. I wondered what people were saying about civilians affected by war. And I don't mean researchers or psychotherapists, but sort of in the popular literature. How are people talking about civilians affected by war? This mattered a lot to me, not just because this is the work that I do, but because civilians, beginning with World War II, make up between 50 and 90% of the casualties of war. But what I found was that about 98% of books on Amazon or hits on Google, when you type in war and mental health, are about soldiers and combatants. And that's when I realized that the experience of civilians was largely missing from the literature. So War Torn was my effort to correct that to some small degree, and also to begin sharing these themes, these stories of people's lives. And I don't know if I have a grand overarching goal with this book, but if I do, it's this sense that we go to war far too easily. And it gets easier the more removed it is. And I want it to be less removed and less easy. So let me begin. I'll begin where I began. In a small clinic in the highlands of Guatemala. This is 1991. The genocide in Guatemala was trailing off. It was still basically a military state and a state of terror in the country, but there was a civilian government, and people were making small attempts to create healing spaces. I was a volunteer consultant at this Indian health organization, and this is a story called Frozen Grief. My colleague Martin was intense and animated. He was a great storyteller, always pausing long enough at key moments to just build the suspense, then finishing with an ending that left you laughing, or in tears, or simply bewildered by the crazy things that happened in this country. He came in one morning dressed in his usual jeans and buttoned-down shirt, looking agitated. "Man," he said, "you won't believe this one, Ken." "Okay, go on." "Well, he just heard about a woman, I'll call her Maria, maybe 50 years old, a Mayan Indian who lived in a small village near Lake Atitlan, the deepest lake in Central America. Atitlan is ringed by steep mountains that were thought to be home to armed guerrillas during the war. That made the villages surrounding the lake hot targets for the army, whose strategy was to terrorize the villagers into submission and destroy any real or potential support they might be inclined to offer the guerrillas. Maria's teenage son had disappeared during the height of the Army's Scorched Earth campaign. Soldiers took him away at gunpoint one night, along with several other young men from the community. Neither he nor any of the others abducted that night were ever seen or heard from again. That was 10 years ago, Martin said. He paused for a moment, collecting his thoughts, and said, "The thing is, every week she cleans his room, dusts it, wipes it down, sweeps it, keeps everything just as it was the day he was taken away, just in case, he comes back. 10 years, man," he continued, "and she's still waiting for him to come home." "That's a long time," I said. "No way that kid's still alive." "Right, no way." Martin paused a moment. "Imagine that," he said, 10 years and she's still waiting. I saw the sadness in his face. We both knew what Maria couldn't bear to admit. Her son was never coming back. He'd probably been dead for most of the past decade. It's a familiar story lived out by thousands of families. People didn't just disappear in Guatemala, they got disappeared. It's something you did to someone, a transitive verb. Él fue desaparecido, someone might say. He was disappeared. There's no corresponding verb for reappearing because people rarely reappeared. Sure, sometimes the disappeared did show up again, usually as a corpse on the side of a road bearing signs of torture. But there was no need to invent a word for that. Mostly, though, the disappeared remained that way. That left families in a terrible state. What Maria was going through, cleaning her son's room, holding on to hope despite the almost certain reality that he was no longer alive. It's a familiar syndrome in Latin America. Argentines lived through it so often. Psychoanalyst Maria Langer coined the term frozen grief to describe the syndrome she saw among families of the disappeared. It's the painful uncertainty of not knowing a loved one's fate, the anguish and guilt if they give up hope and finally let go. It can feel like an abandonment. You don't want to imagine your child or parent or cousin being tortured in some dark and lonely prison cell, but you also can't let go of the possibility that they might still be alive and could somehow find their way home. So people hold on in a perpetual state of hope, even as they know just somewhere below consciousness that they're holding on to an illusion. As a result, they never really grieve. Healing gets put on hold indefinitely. A body would provide closure, however painful it might be, whatever signs of violence it might bear. A corpse would end the uncertainty and help people move on with their lives. But it doesn't happen that way with disappearances. That's their particularly cruel legacy. You don't get to know. Martin had heard stories like this before, hundreds of them. He'd lived through the worst years of the war, never left the country like a lot of his peers did, just kept his head down at the university where he was finishing his degree and hoped he wouldn't get targeted by the army like so many of his classmates and professors. He knew the stories, but for whatever reason, Maria's experience, the way she still cleaned her son's room in anticipation of his possible return, it really got to him. "He's never coming back, Martin said. "Right, I know. He's not. There's no way." "And she can't see that," he continued. can't allow ourselves to see that. He shook his head as if trying to clear the story from his mind, and poured himself some coffee and sat down at his desk. Morning in Guatemala. After about 6 months in Guatemala, how's this working out? Is this okay? Sound wise? Can you hear okay? Just want to make sure. Can I talk more to the mic? Is that any better? Yeah. I got these new glasses, and when I lean in, it's all blurry, but you can hear. So if it sounds blurry.
You can adjust the microphone higher too.
Oh, how about that?
It seems like when it comes from the side, it sounds a little.
Yeah, maybe that's a little better? Okay, great. So this next story, after about 6 months in Guatemala, we, Debbie, my partner at the time, and I, we headed up to Mexico, just across the border, where about 130 refugee camps had been built, ranging from 30 families to hundreds of families. And we spent about a year living in 2 of those camps, working with the 2 communities. And we got adopted in one of the camps where we spent the most time by this wonderful family who we became very close to. And evenings we would, so they, all the houses were made of corn stalks or dried planks and had dirt floors. They were very simple. But this was a very loving, love-filled home. We were given a little shed in the back with planks on the ground, and it became our bed. And sometimes the kids would sleep with us and sometimes not, but after dinner we'd always sit around the fire and tell stories. So this is one evening. The story is called Escape. We were sitting around the fire one night after dinner, Mateo, his wife Maria, Debbie and I, while the boys played damas, or checkers nearby. We brought chicken and vegetables from the market in San Cristobal, and Maria had cooked up a delicious soup and served it with corn tortillas she'd made that morning. I asked Mateo if he'd share an animal story with us this evening. He laughed with pleasure at the request. He'd memorized a vast collection of traditional Cancobal animal tales. The Cancobales are one of several Mayan Indian groups in Guatemala, and animal stories that convey important life lessons are a rich part of their culture. Mateo told his stories with long pauses at pivotal moments, very intentional. He made it seem like he was just gathering his thoughts, but we knew better. He wanted us on the edge of our seats, waiting eagerly to hear what happened next. He'd gaze off somewhere, spin on the dirt floor, and then find his way back to the story. He also loved to spice up the narrative with Mexican curses, like when Rabbit asked Coyote, "Por qué me vas a chingar así? Why are you going to fuck with me like that?" The boys had heard the stories countless times, but they usually put the checkers aside and joined us when Mateo got started. You could never hear about the trickster Rabbit, wise in some stories and mischievous in others, or old Coyote, by turns gullible and deceitful, too many times. And of course, he changed things a bit with each telling. Like any good storyteller, Mateo didn't just repeat, he reinvented, adding new details so that the same old stories were never really the same at all. Tonight, though, he was congested. He couldn't breathe through his nose and was clearly uncomfortable. I pulled out some decongestants from my knapsack and offered him 2 tablets. He'd never heard of Sudafed, but swallowed them readily. And maybe I was just feeling playful after a long day of work, or maybe the wannabe anthropologist in me wondered how humor would translate across cultural lines. After he'd swallowed the tablets, I said with feigned concern, "Oh man, I should have warned you, these pills, they sometimes cause a 3rd leg to grow." Debbie looked up, startled by my bizarre comment. But Mateo simply gazed over at me with a curious expression. "Interesting," he said. "Small or large, 3rd leg?" "Oh, quite large," I said, "but one never knows." "Oh, good. It could be useful for long days in the cornfield. It'll give me something to rest on." Sensing a challenge, I continued, "Well, the pills can also cause baldness." "Bald, maybe, but still alive," he responded serenely. "Okay, but they've been known to cause a 2nd nose to appear, right there, next to the first one." "Great," he said with a big smile. "Then if one nose gets stuffed, I can breathe through the other one. Won't need any more of these pills." It was a brief moment of silence. Then with a twinkle in his eye, Mateo asked if the pills ever changed a man into a bull. Sure, I said, it's been known to happen, half bull, half man. At that point, Maria joined in. With a mischievous grin, she said, that would make it easier for a man to mount his woman. We all laughed so hard, the dogs outside started barking. Sometimes we talk about the war. One evening, Mateo described the family's escape from Guatemala 10 years earlier. He said, we were living in Yalanwitz. It's a tiny village in the department of Huehuetenango. That's where we had our land. One day a man arrived in the village. He'd been running and was out of breath. He told us about a massacre in the village of San Francisco, lots of people killed by soldiers. He said the army was going from village to village, killing the people and the animals, burning the houses and crops. They killed people in the village of Yalan Bajot as well. He was just coming home from working in the fields when he saw what was happening and fled before the soldiers could see him. By the next morning, we packed everything we could carry and started walking north into the mountains. Many people from the village, only 25 people stayed behind. There were many of us from the village who left. We heard that when the army came to Yalanwitz, they asked those who didn't leave, are you guerrillas? And they said, no, we're not. But those people who left, who are in the mountain now, they're supporters of the guerrillas. The soldiers asked, where did everyone go? And those who didn't leave, they said, they ran away, and I guess they pointed north towards Mexico. And then, under order from the soldiers, the people who stayed behind were forced to burn down the houses of those who had left. There were 9 of us from my family who left together, Maria and me and our children. The youngest was still just a baby, not even a year old. Our plan was to hide in the mountains and see what happened, wait for things to calm down. But you couldn't just walk out in the open. The army had helicopters, and they flew overhead looking for anyone fleeing, and there were soldiers everywhere. If they caught you, Mateo made a hand gesture, a kind of snapping motion with his hand that was common in the region. It meant really bad. So we made our way through forests and cornfields and stayed hidden that way. Once when it was night, we heard the sound of soldiers coming close to where we were walking. There was a road that ran through the field, and we hadn't realized how close we'd gotten to it. The corn was high and thick, and we sat down as quietly as possible while the soldiers walked past. See their boots through the corn stalks and hear their voices. The smallest sound, and they would have found us. We all held our breath, breathed as quietly as we could. Maria kept her hand over the baby's mouth so he wouldn't cry. Finally, the soldiers disappeared down the road, and we continued on our way. He paused then, looked away and spat. We all sat quietly. A dog barked outside, but otherwise the only sound was the gentle crackling of the fire. Mateo continued his story. We spent 2 months in the mountains before we came down into Mexico. It was a terrible time. It was the rainy season, and the sound of the wind blowing through the trees at night was scary. We had only a plastic sheet for protection. We had no food, so we ate what we could find in the forest. The mosquitoes were terrible, and there were other insects. It hurt a lot when they stung, but we had no protection. Finally, after 2 months, we realized the war was not going to end soon. That's when we decided to come down out of the mountains into Mexico. After we'd gone to bed, I lay awake reflecting on the family's perilous escape. I was struck by the precariousness of life in the context of war. It's all right there in that image, a terrified family huddled in a darkened field, trying desperately to remain silent and unseen. A broken twig, the sound of an infant's cry, the smallest noise as the soldiers passed by, and everyone in the family would have died in that cornfield. But they made no sound. They survived the night and the days and nights that followed, and disappeared into the safety of the thickly forested Cuchumatan Mountains that lay to the north. After I worked in Guatemala, I came back and directed a clinic in Chicago with Bosnian refugees. I think I'm going to jump over Bosnia just to keep this relatively brief and have a little time for discussion, and go right on to Afghanistan. So I left Chicago after 2 years at the clinic, wanting to find more creative ways of working with refugees than I could do it in a traditional clinical structure of a state-funded mental health clinic. And I was doing a lot of work with Afghan and Bosnian refugee communities in the San Francisco area. And one day, just fortuitously met a colleague who was living and working in Kabul. This is 2004, just after, I guess it's 3 years post-Taliban's departure from Kabul. And she invited me to come over and collaborate with her. And I said yes. And over the next few years, we developed a series of research studies in Kabul to assess mental health and identify groups of particular need of support and intervention. So the first thing we did in our first study was to get our wonderful research team together in a room and just sit down and ask them over kebabs and endless cups of green tea, chai sabs, to tell us about how Afghans talk about distress and healing. And the head of our team, these are all local Kabul, Afghans from Kabul, this big bear of a man, Salman Khan. He featured a lot in the book because he's one of my favorite people. He's about 6'5", and he's burly, and he has a giant turban and a big beard, and he looks like a mujahideen, a freedom fighter, just come down from the mountain. Except he's not. He hates violence, and he's a community representative, an activist, a peace activist actually, in a place where that's a very dangerous calling. So Salman Khan wanted to help us out because we had said, well, how did Afghans talk about suffering and well-being? And he said, I have a story about that. And he told us this story. It was during the war against the Soviets, he said. I was driving my truck up a steep mountain road with trees and dirt on one side and a steep cliff on the other. In the back of the truck were one of my sisters and her children and some other members of my family. At a Mujahideen checkpoint, Mujahideen were the freedom fighters, I had to stop the truck and get out to show the soldiers my papers. Salman paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts. He gazed at the table as he continued. When I got out of the truck, I forgot to set the brake. Before I could react, the truck began to roll backwards, towards the cliff. In a moment, it was spiraling off the cliff, falling hundreds of feet until it crashed in the valley below. Everyone died. Salman looked down as he described pulling the mangled bodies of his sister and her children out of the truck so that he could bring them home to Kabul for burial. It was a gruesome task, he said, shaking his head. It was terrible. The room was quiet as he finished speaking. He looked up and gazed at me intently, awaiting a response, but I had no idea what to say. I felt sickened and pained by the grief his story evoked. After a minute, I asked how he had coped with the tragedy, how he had stayed sane in the aftermath. He took a moment to reflect, as though it wasn't something he'd considered before. He said it took him several months to deal with his grief, but eventually he made a choice to use the inner resources God had given him, the Islamic concept of sabr, or patience, and an acceptance of a greater plan that he couldn't understand. He also had the support of family and friends, and that helped pull him out of the darkness. It gave him hope that the pain would eventually pass. Afghans talk about hope like a fork in the road. If you hold on to it, you'll emerge from despair and in time recover emotionally. But if you let go of hope, if you go down the other road, it leads to what they call leaving the world. It's not suicide exactly, because you don't die. You just withdraw from the people around you, the relationships and activities that fill your days, and sink into grief, isolation, and hopelessness. For Afghans whose sense of self is so deeply rooted in their social relationships, it really is a form of psychological suicide, a kind of withering away. In the West, we'd probably call it a major depressive disorder, this leaving the world. Personally, I prefer the Afghan term. It's more picturesque, and it captures perfectly what happens when people sink deeply into depression. They get lost in pain or become emotionally numb. They leave behind the people and activities that once gave them pleasure. They withdraw into a place where hope seems like nothing but a distant memory. I couldn't help myself. I had to ask about PTSD. It seemed like exactly the sort of traumatic event that would give rise to the disorder. I asked Salman Khan if he experienced nightmares or intrusive images of the truck accident, in the days and weeks after it occurred. He nodded knowingly. He'd worked on a mental health study before and was familiar with the symptoms of PTSD. He said, people here have a strong belief in God, so we forget those images, those scenes. The images and memories disappear in time, but the jiarchun, the deep sadness or heartbreak, that stays with people, sometimes forever. Everyone nodded in agreement. Upsetting images of the war, they said, usually disappeared within several weeks after a traumatic experience, but the sadness, the depression, that could last indefinitely. Then Salman Khan added, everyone here has their own terrible stories of the war, so we don't talk about them. It's easier that way. Buddhists say that avoidance or aversion is at the heart of a lot of suffering. Trauma specialists say the same thing. The avoidance of trauma-related memories and feelings only keeps them alive, unprocessed, festering. But in a place where everyone has lived through 25 years of war, I wondered whether there might be a sort of adaptive avoidance, an unspoken understanding that talking about terrible events will just stir up everyone's memories, uprooting whatever equilibrium they've managed to find. After Salman finished telling the story of the truck on the mountain, someone said sadly, "This is Afghanistan. Such stories are common. We're used to them." Someone else added, "These stories of violence and loss no longer shock us. We've heard them so many times, we've listened to them for 25 years. The comments made sense to me. Afghans have been living with war for a very long time. I imagined a lot of people that learned to adapt to the violence, loss, and deprivation in ways that allowed them to continue functioning, to keep on living despite the chronic adversity. Everyone on the research team also understood the importance of sabr, and they knew how critical it was to maintain hope no matter how bleak the circumstances. Nobody seemed surprised that Salman Khan had overcome such a powerful tragedy and was again living a meaningful and productive life. But I also suspect there's another factor behind Salman Khan's emotional recovery. He was no internalizer, my friend Salman Khan. He didn't blame himself for what happened on that terrible day on the mountain. The tragedy, he insisted, was the fault of the mujahideen who forced him to stop the truck on the edge of a cliff, not his for failing to set the brake. Everyone in the room agreed with him. Self-blame seems more the province of Westerners, the bread and butter of psychotherapy, the root of so much emotional pain back home. Not in Afghanistan, though, or at least not among men. And that's probably a good thing, because if Salman were to focus on the brake he forgot to set rather than the mujahideen who forced him to stop in the first place, I imagine his intense brown eyes might sparkle just a bit less brightly. After we finished our first survey of mental health in Kabul, it took about 2 weeks, 24/7, we were all exhausted. So I took a couple weeks to just wander the city. This is back when you could just wander the city. Now that wouldn't be a wise thing, but then it was all right. And I eventually sort of befriended these two young kids who followed me around and eventually became friends of a sort. This is a very short story called Street Kids. Two boys, one about 12, the other tiny, a dwarf. His age, impossible to tell. They followed me around, asking repeatedly if they could shine my shoes, though I wore sandals made of tan leather, and they had only black polish. And they were undeterred. I chatted with them in my limited diary. I learned that they lived with their families, whose income they supplemented with shoeshine work and the occasional bit of bakshish, or charity. My friends told me not to give money to street kids and only encouraged parents to continue sending them out begging. But these boys got to me with their intense brown eyes, their expressions serious beyond their years, and the absurdity of their insistence on shining my sandals. They appeared each time I walked a mile from the guest house to the internet cafe or a bit farther to the markets on Chicken Street. After a few days of walking together, I began to look forward to their company. One day when they didn't appear, I grew worried and wondered if they were all right. Kabul is a rough city with a dark underworld. Children can disappear into myriad black holes of despair, forced prostitution, drug smuggling, forced labor in carpet or brick-making businesses, or random sexual abuse by a predator wandering the city. But a lot of the kids who worked the streets were savvy, street-smart survivors who could spot danger and vanish in an instant. I hoped my two young friends were among the clever ones. The next day, en route to the internet cafe, I heard familiar voices approaching from behind. "Hey, mister, Shushanai?" I looked down at my sandals and smiled. In 2006, I was all set to go back to Kabul for the third round of studies when my colleague, Dado B, got sick and had to fly back to the States for treatment. So I had all this grant money. It was not earmarked for a particular grant. I could do whatever I wanted with it. And I had a Sri Lankan colleague, Kenneth Fernando, a psychologist at UCLA, whose funding had just fallen through for a project that she had designed and was ready to go in the eastern district of Sri Lanka, right on the front line, eastern front line of the civil war between the Sinhalese or Buddhist government and the Tamil Tigers. So we partnered up. I went to Sri Lanka, funded the study, and she invited me in. And I went over about a week before she got there just to see the island. This was about a year and a half after a tsunami had laid waste to much of the coastal part of the country. It's about 20 miles south of India. So I'm going to jump into the middle of the story. I'd been just rented a motorcycle and was just riding up and down the Gal Road in the south, looking at the ruins of villages that had been absolutely decimated by the tsunami. Back at the hotel, I parked the motorbike and wandered down to the internet cafe across the way. A young man with a friendly smile waved me over. We'd seen each other in the cafe before, but we'd never spoken. He introduced himself as Sampath and invited me to sit and share a glass or two of lemon gin. He was a sweet guy, a photographer, couldn't have been more than 30 years old. He told me he was Sinhalese and had married a Tamil woman. That shouldn't matter, but in his view it ended up getting her killed and turning him into a widower. Sampath said that he and his wife were expecting a child some years ago, and during her last month of pregnancy, she traveled north to see her parents in Jaffna. He said the Tamil Tigers decided to send a warning message about Tamils marrying Sinhalese. So they tied his wife to a signpost and cut open her belly, killing both her and the unborn child. He described this graphically, motioning with his hands to make sure I understood the gruesome nature of the murder. As he spoke, he looked into my eyes with an unsettling intensity to be sure I was listening. As he spoke, then he gazed into the distance behind me, as if pulled into the terrible imagery that he just described. I found myself feeling thankful for the numbing effect the gin was having on my brain. I didn't want to picture the scene he painted, and the gin kept things blurry. Sampath continued with his story. He said he still woke up every night from nightmares about the child he never had the chance to see, his only memory, an image of his butchered wife and the fetus she carried. The images won't stop, he said. It didn't matter whether he was awake or asleep. It had been 12 years and the gruesome pictures just wouldn't go away. I uttered some words of empathy, but he talked right past them. He didn't even seem to hear me. After the killing, he hit bottom, wandered up to Goa, a former Portuguese colony that's become a hippie and techno scene on the northwest coast of India. There he became addicted to anything that would numb the pain and dull the memories. He eventually found his way to a rehab center back in Sri Lanka in the beautiful mountain city of Kandy, and it was in Kandy that he met one of Golda Meir's grandsons. She was a former prime minister of Israel, who invited him to come to Israel and spend some time on a kibbutz. It sounded appealing, a chance to connect with the land and with himself as well. In Israel, Sampath got his life together and came back to Sri Lanka and started a photography business. It was really taking off, he said. Business was good and he was feeling hopeful about the future for the first time in years. One night in December of 2004, he was shooting a wedding at the Lighthouse, a ritzy hotel on the south coast, just off the Gal Road, a few minutes from where we were talking. It was late when he finally was able to head home, so he left his gear in the hotel rather than carry it with him on his motorcycle. The tsunami hit that night, and the water destroyed everything, all of his equipment. Sisyphus in the boulder, a life rebuilt, taken down again by a series of massive waves. We sat in silence for a few moments, listening to the sound of the waves breaking against the beach. He smiled then, in a genuine way that caught me by surprise. Who could smile after what he'd been through, the story he just told? He said, you have to keep smiling and see the glass of life as half full. It's the only way to survive. He'd gotten a new camera and had landed several gigs already. You've got to stay positive, he said. It's just those dreams. If I could just stop those horrible images from entering my dreams, I'd be okay. Lying in bed later that night, I listened to the waves outside my window. The sounds of the sea have always been calming to me, a primal response to the rhythm of water. But this night the ocean made me uneasy, its destructive power barely hidden beneath the gentle sound of the waves. I couldn't stop thinking about the evening's conversation about the cruelty and terrible losses my friend in the cafe had endured. I'm not exactly sure how we come to terms with the effects of evil on our lives. A natural disaster isn't malicious. A tsunami doesn't intentionally cause harm. It simply happens, indifferent to the destruction it creates and the despair it leaves in its wake. But to experience the death of a loved one killed with absolute intentionality will always be tender. And yet, so many survivors of traumatic violence do seem to find ways of seeing the glass of life as half full. I continue to marvel at this will to not just survive, but to really live, to build anew, to regain one's faith in the better side of human nature. I've seen it everywhere my work has taken me. It's inspirational, like watching a flower grow out of concrete or break through the surface of snow. At times it feels like witnessing something quietly profound, a kind of inner grace that springs from somewhere just beyond my comprehension. And I close with just a small excerpt from the epilogue. In 2015, I'd finished the book, but it needed an ending. Partly because it had a prologue. My editor said, you can't have a prologue without an epilogue. And I said, yeah, but it's over. The book is done. And you need an epilogue. So I wrote an epilogue, and she said, that's not a good epilogue. So I put it on hold, and I went back to Afghanistan for a month on a consulting gig with the International Medical Corps. I hadn't been back in 9 years. And I could not believe how bad things had gotten. It was truly a country of war. Kabul in 2006 was still more or less safe to run around as long as you staggered your runs at different places and days and times. By 2015, you weren't allowed to leave the guest house. None of the NGO, none of the internationals were allowed to. In the short time I was there were 3 suicide bombings in Kabul. But far more terrifying to me, far more dismaying than the suicide bombings was an incident with a young woman called Farkunda. Happened while I was in the hospital working just down the road, a kilometer away. She was a young woman, Islamic studies scholar, who came walking down the street past the Grand Mosque, the big mosque in Kabul, and saw a man selling words of the Prophet that he'd written on pieces of paper to sick, poor people, promising them that this would cure their cancer or whatever. And she called him out on it, and she said, You're deceiving people. You're stealing their money. Well, the head of the mosque witnessed that, and he screamed as loud as he could, this woman is burning the Quran. Didn't take long. 50 men grabbed Farkunda, grabbed rocks, grabbed sticks, beat her to death, ran her over with a car, lit her on fire, and then threw her body into the Kabul riverbed. Why didn't anyone call the police? They didn't need to. They were watching it. This happened in front of a police station. This shook me up more than the Taliban and more than Al-Qaeda, because I get the rules of war, and even those guys have rules of war. This was everyday Afghans who were so proud of what they'd done that they got caught because they posted it on YouTube and Facebook. And that's when I knew, truly knew, if I didn't know in 2002 already, this was a war we could never, ever win. And yet, for all of the horrors of Afghanistan, some of the people I love most in the world are Afghans that I've gotten to know and gotten very close to there. like my friend Holland. I'm going to jump into the end of the epilogue here. Actually, you don't need to buy the book, because this is the ending of it. And it's like when Harry met Sally, he always reads the last chapter. This is the end. But I'm not giving away anything. Afghanistan embodies much of what I've learned in my years of working in countries affected by war. First, there's the extraordinary power of culture in shaping reactions to violence and loss. I don't just mean how people talk about suffering, how they cope with it, but all the ways they find to heal and move on with their lives. Now, not everyone moves on, of course. Healing doesn't always happen. There's the bottomless heartbreak of Jigahun when the losses are too great and there's no one there to stop the descent into despair. Or the nervousness and rage of persistent asabi, like trauma, untouched by the passage of time. Mostly, though, people do heal, though the healing is often imperfect, with thin scars just strong enough to hold. The support of family, the power of faith, and the patience and will to endure, known as sabr, are enough to help most people find their way to solid ground. Then there's the reality that suffering in settings of armed conflict isn't just about the violence of war. There's a growing recognition of the impact daily stressors have on mental health, the stressful conditions of everyday life. The social fabric has eroded, poverty is widespread, and all forms of violence have become legitimized. The abuse of women and children in Afghanistan, as in other war zones, is no less a source of trauma and despair than suicide bombings and rocket attacks. And finally, there is this. Darkness and light always coexist. The savagery of armed combatants is pervasive in Afghanistan, as it is in other war zones. But so too is the courage of peacemakers and community leaders like Samir Khan, who won't be silenced by fear. Corrupt politicians who pocket aid money and adorn their heavily guarded mansions are easy to spot. But look around, and you'll find community organizations working tirelessly to heal the social and emotional wounds of war, build schools, teach women to read and write, and get poor families loans to start their own businesses. I don't know what impact these organizations have, what they're actually able to achieve under the difficult circumstances in which they carry out their work. I do know this, however. I find inspiration in their impassioned commitment to counter the myriad effects of war in all their many forms. I feel a renewed strength and a deepened sense of meaning when I think of my friends here and in every war-torn country in which I've spent time. Their work is a kind of love story, and it is for me profoundly redemptive. Thank you. I don't know if we have a few minutes for discussion, but I'd love to. Yeah.
What's going to happen to Afghanistan after we leave?
It's going to descend into something probably, I invite with some human rights experts in here who may have different perspectives than I do. My sense is it's going to descend into something somewhat resembling what it was before. It's unclear how that will turn out. The Taliban are remarkably strong. There's an ISIS affiliate that has emerged in Afghanistan, but I think it's going to first go through a period of intense civil war, and then probably there'll be a capitulation. I think the Taliban are much better well trained and will be better armed than the Afghan army.
How big a danger will it be in the United States?
That's a really hard one to say. I mean, it really depends if we're willing to engage with the new government. I think we can have a say in that. I think if we have a bellicose, on the off chance that we get a rather bellicose and aggressive president, I would suggest that it's going to become an enormous threat to the United States. Sometimes in realpolitik, you end up having to be on good terms with people you despise. The reality is that I think if we can engage, the Taliban never wanted to go to war with the United States, and the Taliban were not responsible directly for what happened on 9/11. They hosted someone they didn't particularly like. They hosted Al-Qaeda, and what we need to do is keep that happening again. But I don't think the Taliban ever had any interest in doing anything other than imposing a horrific state of affairs on Afghanistan. And I think one of the hard things that we may have to live with is that Afghans may live under a horrific state of affairs. But that's not something we can necessarily change. We have been trying since 2001, and it hasn't shown promise. I don't say this lightly. I have a lot of Afghan friends and friends in Afghanistan, and it breaks my heart. But at some point, we have to recognize that what we're doing isn't working. That's my
They
take.
control 2/3 of the country now.
I don't know the exact numbers, but it's tremendous.
I mean, it's majority.
And you know, and I obviously I'm not a big fan. I mean, by my comments, you can infer I'm not a big fan of the administration. But you know, I was also very critical. President Obama in 2012 gave a speech in which he called the Taliban broken. I think that 2014, 2 years later, they had the highest kill rate of civilians in all the years that have been recorded. So we have not done well there. And that breaks my heart, because the majority of Afghans, you know, they've lived through war since 1979. It is the only reality. Given the average lifespan of about 44, 45 years, the average Afghan has barely known anything but war. And that's a heartbreak. Yes?
Can you speak a little more about your work there? Like work psychologists could be in this kind of
In a place like Afghanistan.
places like Afghanistan. I mean, you did mention you did a survey and talking to people.
Yeah. So in Afghanistan, I was there more as a researcher rather than an intervention. I wasn't doing intervention research. I was working with organizations that did interventions. And one of the big requests that people had was they wanted some epidemiological data. What levels of distress, who were the most vulnerable groups that they, and what kinds of interventions were most needed. So what we needed to do was first develop culturally meaningful assessment tools, which is the first part of the research, and then identify groups, which, not surprisingly, were women and then widows in particular, really vulnerable. And there were groups like, well, there were a lot of different NGOs that what they did with these kinds of data were wonderful. Afghans don't tend to seek out mental health care, but widows, for example, will come for material aid programs to get food, to get clothes. And in the context of that, the NGOs providing the aid started creating supportive groups where women could sit together and maybe get literacy skills. But in the context of getting literacy skills, mental health strategies were incorporated into the group so that they became a place where women could talk about what they had lived through and what the challenges were that they were facing. So there were ways that you could begin, and a number of grassroots groups were using the measure, the questionnaire that we developed, to do a variety of interventions, from putting on prosthetics to, because a lot of people had lost legs and arms and landmines, to social support groups, to literacy groups, livelihoods programs, but they wanted to measure the mental health impact of these non-mental health interventions. So the tool that we developed, we called it the Afghan Symptom Checklist, was used as a way of measuring the impact on mental health of different kinds of interventions. So that was kind of the role that it played there. In other countries, my work has been much more about actually developing and testing out interventions. So in Gaza, with Lebanese, in Lebanon with Syrian refugees. There's a bigger question that I struggle with all the time, which is what is the role of mental health work with people who are living in chronic adversity? And this is a question I try not to think about too much, because when I think about it a lot, I kind of get depressed. Sometimes the work that I do feels like, imagine a film where you're zoomed in and you see people rowing a canoe hard, and you see them making progress through the water, and then the camera pans out. And the farther it pans out, the more you see that they're actually being moved faster than they're rowing forward towards a waterfall, towards a giant abyss. Sometimes it feels that way. I just got back from Gaza not that long ago, where we developed this intervention to provide support to parents. We were doing a lot of work in my organization with kids, and parents were saying, hey, it's great that you work with kids, but we're really stressed out too, we need something. And the research is really clear. If you study the mental health effects of war on children, what you find is that about 50% of their trauma is related to family violence, and this is true in every country where it's been studied. And the pathway is pretty clear. War stresses out parents. The chronic adversity, the chronic deprivation leads parents to get much less patient. It's not, look, there's some NGOs that go in and they do parenting programs, and they teach parents how to parent better. I don't agree with that. Well, look, we can all parent better. That's not what I mean. What I mean is, you take the most effective parents in the world, take away their homes, their livelihoods, their sense of belonging, their community, their income, their capacity to fulfill the most important roles in their lives, of spouse, partner, parent, and then measure the quality of their parenting. See if it doesn't deteriorate. So what we did is, in my organization, we developed a program where the first 5 weeks is for parents, is just about helping them regulate their own stress and distress and get the support of the group. And we have a lot of mindfulness techniques that they learn. And then we focus on parenting and adversity. So anyway, we're doing it in Gaza. The Gazan parents loved it. It really caught on. And the Syrians loved it. So now we're testing it out in a big randomized controlled trial. But sometimes when I was doing this and my Gazan colleague was continuing to lead this intervention, I had these moments of, like, my gosh, 50% or so unemployment, an open-air prison. Gazans can't leave to the north or east because Israel blocks it. If they go west, Israel shoots down the boats more than 5 miles out to sea, and Egypt has blocked the southern exit, so there's nowhere to go. Life is despondent, and sometimes doing this work feels a little bit like, I don't know, putting a Band-Aid on someone who's got a gaping wound. So then I zoom the camera back in, and I listen to the comments of parents who say, wow, 8 weeks into this intervention, and I'm not hitting my kids. I'm listening to them. I started teaching the mindfulness technique to my kid. Or, my wife said something that really made me angry, and I was going to strike her, but instead, I counted to 10, I took a walk around the camp or the block, and I came back and I said, why did you do this thing? And then I understood it was an accident. So those are little things. But to that man and his wife and his kids, they're big. And that's what I try to stay focused on. Yeah.
I'm going to ask you something a little outside your book. I mean, you're a psychologist, and the book is about the trauma experienced by people in war-torn societies. And most of us will never be, fortunately, in that situation. However, living in a place like the United States, there are families who are devastated by tragedies, personal losses, and so forth, traumatic. And though they live in a society where it's not their entire neighborhood where people have similar experiences of trauma, they're more isolated within the society. What has your research told you about the way people deal with trauma outside of the situations where everybody around you is experiencing horrible losses in one way or another, or it has taught you nothing? I mean, what is and the other part of the question is, does the fact that these people are living surrounded by people having gone through similar situations change the way that they cope?
Yeah. Well, all of my research has been in war zones and refugee camps, so I can't speak from my own research to the question you're asking, but we can speak more broadly from the research literature, because most of the research on trauma has taken place in places like the United States and Europe and Australia. What we know is this. This always surprises people. The majority of the people who experience a traumatic event don't develop post-traumatic stress disorder. It's a minority. Now, sometimes it's a big minority, but it's a minority. And it's usually not a big minority. Even sexual assault, the majority of sexual assault survivors will eventually heal and recover if they have good social support. This surprises people. It's the same with grief. Grief, the American Psychiatric Association is pushing real hard to be able to diagnose grief as major depression. They give you, they gave you 6 months to grieve and get on with it. If you still look depressed, you got a psychiatric diagnosis. But they were pushing that to shrink that to 2 weeks, to pathologize what is the most human and universal experience, which is grief. Most people who grieve hurt a lot and then stop hurting, and they find their way to solid ground. So what you're asking about is, okay, but what about that minority of folks who do struggle with enduring trauma or prolonged grief? Well, what we know is we have really good treatments. And the biggest challenge is not a lack of effective treatment. The biggest challenge is getting people to access that care. Middle class and upper middle class folks are much more likely to seek out mental health treatment, and it works far more often than it doesn't. There's all kinds of really good evidence-based trauma treatments and treatments for prolonged grief that are helpful. The problem is when you look at minority communities and low-income communities, they don't get these treatments. I worked very briefly in a community mental health center after my postdoc. I was expected to see 16 people a day, 5 days a week. You tell me what kind of trauma treatment you can do when you got 20 minutes and you do assembly line work. So, you know, the thing that makes healing so hard in war zones and refugee camps is that once people's world returns to normal. Man has written a wonderful book. You have to look up his name. I can't remember titles anymore. But it's not an academic book. It's a book for everyone. He's a brilliant researcher in New York who studies trauma and loss and how people get over them and get through them. And you know, what he's demonstrated with really impressive research over the years is that we are more resilient than we are fragile. But we can be fragile, and the fragility is important to address when people are damaged or wounded. And the most important thing, and this is what's missing in war zones, is a return to normality. Once you get safe, you can heal. So the mandate in trauma work, right, the first thing you have to do before you do trauma treatment is get people safe. That's why we don't treat battered women clinically as a rule while they're still getting battered. It's why you never, ever treat an abused child before you get that child safe. Right? You can't do trauma treatment while the trauma's ongoing, or it's a lot harder, and ethically you violate all kinds of guidelines. But what do you do in a war zone or a refugee camp where you can't get people safe? And that's a great dilemma that the humanitarian world has yet to struggle with. And that's sort of the unspoken elephant in the room now that I think people are beginning to think about. Anyway, it's a long-winded way of saying people do heal. Sometimes they need treatment, but the treatments are good. We just need to help people gain access to them. What I would also say, this is my cynicism, it's something I talk about in the book. I would never say people shouldn't get psychiatric medication who want to try it and who might benefit from it. The evidence on psychological, meaning non-medicinal medications, versus psychopharmacological medications is that the psychological ones are at least as, if not more effective, and much longer lasting. The problem with the pills is that when you stop taking them, the effects seem to go away. And with psychological treatments, the effects seem to last and last and last. Some people really do benefit from medication, but you know, one of the things I talk about in the book, because I get very frustrated in the developing world, you see medication really heavily marketed, is except for really severe depression, antidepressants are about as good as placebo. And that's not something you hear from Eli Lilly, but it's very well documented. So anyway, there's a lot of effective treatments. I know we're going to need to wind down. Any last comment or question? Yes?
Do safe zones work?
In zones where they're like the UN declares a safe
Sure.
zone. All you got to do is look at Bosnia to see the answer to that question.
Which,
And everywhere the UN created a safe zone, people were slaughtered. Safe zones work depending on the goodwill of whoever they're supposed to keep out. And you know, if you have Bosnian Serbs heavily determined to remove Bosnian Muslims from the country by any means necessary, you know, a bunch of guys with blue helmets on isn't going to make much of a difference. You saw that throughout the country. You see it in Africa. Everywhere there's a safe zone. There's horrific violence. I have yet to see. There may be examples of safe zones that have worked really well if they're well fortified, but I don't think it's a model that has shown great support.
What's the answer? What would the response to U.S., what should have U.S.'s response been to the Syrian refugee crisis? I mean, just one or two major things.
I wish I could tell you.
Nothing broad scale that the
No.
country could do.
I can't, I mean, I was just in Lebanon recently asking two colleagues of mine who are like the top Dutch Middle East correspondents for Dutch TV this very same question, because I'm at a loss, absolutely at a loss, and I'm not usually, I usually have some idea about what I think should happen. I had no idea. And what they said is they didn't know either, that whatever opportunity there had been had come and gone. I think they felt that there was a time really early on where, so if you remember the history, right, it was a group of young people protesting against the Syrian regime, against just the conditions of life in the country, the devastation through climate change of the farm industry. All farms were disappearing. This is the worst drought in recorded history in Syria. There were all kinds of repressive measures, and these young people went out and they protested. There was no ISIS in Syria at that time, and they were met with horrific violence. They were tortured, people were killed. Well, that triggered a counter-reaction, and not a counter-reaction, and then you had the emergence of a civil war. And into that chaos, ISIS stepped. I don't think it was called the Islamic State, it became the Islamic State. It settled in Raqqa, I believe. And early on, some people believe we could have sided with the protesters against Assad. But you know, one of the things I've learned is that hindsight is cheap, and interventions that look pretty clear-cut, like let's get rid of Gaddafi in Libya. I wouldn't want to have a vacation home in Libya right now.
No, but you've been in these places before, and you see them over and over again. Doesn't it ever, any of you guys ever brainstorm and think, what response would be use?
Yeah, sure you think about it.
But
Sometimes
there's no standard.
There's not. Yeah, it's frustrating as hell. I agree. Now, mind you, I'm not a politician, but look, clearly the politicians haven't solved this one either. I'm mindful that you've been incredibly attentive for over an hour, and so we probably wind it down. I want to thank y'all for coming out. It's a beautiful summer night in Cape Cod, and I'm sure there were other places you could have been. So thanks so much for coming out. If you're interested in the book, we've got some copies up front, or otherwise just stop by and say hi. Thank you.
Thank you.